Welcome to the Words That Change Lives podcast, helping leaders, coaches, and small business owners to 10 times the impact of their message. Join us as we delve into the art of powerful language, enabling you to speak with unwavering honesty, communicate authentically, and create a lasting impression with every word. You know that feeling when you are listening to someone giving a presentation or a talk, or you're reading a book and suddenly the plot jumps from one place to the other and you're left feeling confused and like you don't know what's going on and you have to flip back and forwards. Well, when someone's actually giving a talk and that happens, it can disengage the audience. And today I am talking about the art of the segue. Now, that is something that reads differently to how it sounds. It's spelled S-E-G-U-E and it's pronounced segue. And the way to describe this is thinking of a segue like a connection tissue in the body. So just like muscles need tendons and ligaments to work together smoothly, your ideas need segues to flow naturally. And without these, it can feel disjointed, out of place, and like a muscle with proper support. So today we're going to learn how to build that connective tissue into your speeches so that your audience can follow you from point A to point B seamlessly. And why this matters is because when you're leading a meeting, you're delivering a keynote, or presenting an idea, your message is only as strong as how it flows. And a great idea can lose impact if your audience can't follow your thinking. This is something that I picked up way back when I started training people in classrooms. I had to find a way of enabling one piece of information to flow to the next in a really smooth way so that you could bring people with you on the flow of the workshop or the program that I was delivering. And then later, when I went to move into things like presentations, town halls, keynote talks, and TED Talks, the art of the segue really came into its own. It's such a stark thing when you listen and you hear when people use segues effectively or when they don't. And so that is why I am sharing this information with you today. So what is a segue? Simply, it is a smooth transition from one topic idea to another. It's a small but mighty phrase that links thoughts together. So let's give an example. In a speech about leadership, you might transition from talking about vision to execution. And in order to do that, you might say something like, having a clear vision is important, but without execution, that vision is a dream. So I'm going to share how we can turn that dream into reality. So we're moving from the vision part of the talk or presentation to the execution part, and you're using a segue to do that. I'll give you another example. I've coached leaders who give board presentations, and sometimes they can struggle with the transitions in board presentations. So one client that I was coaching, the content was absolutely there, but he would jump from discussing one thing like market trends to financials without any transition. So often you can lose people, or he was losing people, he was losing his teams, he was losing the board, getting confused, and it can actually lose you credibility. So I worked with him to craft some simple segues, such as, so we've seen where the market is heading, we need to dive into how this impacts our financial outlook. There we go. Then we move on to the financial outlook. And that one small change seems really tiny, leads to more engagement and a clearer understanding. So what happens without a segue? Well, we need to understand that so we can identify it. And I'm sure you can, or you can cast your mind back. But let's give an example. So I've attended a talk where the speaker jumped from talking about company culture to then discussing data analytics with no transition. And 1 minute, you're nodding along. And then the next, the room's sort of filled with confused faces. You've lost the room. For about 5 minutes, because someone will mentally check out if they're not sure where the flow of that idea is going. So without having the seg, your audience feels like they're constantly catching up, or they've been thrown into the middle of a conversation. Another way that people sometimes do this is literally just pausing. So you'll say one thing, then you'll pause, and then you move on to the next thing. Now, sometimes that works if you want to emphasize a pause, but in most situations, you need a segue. So imagine a speaker going from discussing a vision for change to suddenly introducing a new budget without a connection. It's like flipping channels from Netflix to BBC without knowing how the story changed. So now I want to give you some examples of effective segues, and there are a number of different ones. So I'm going to share those with you. We've got the verbal segues first. And a verbal is the simplest type of segue. It directly signals to your audience that you're moving on. So for instance, you might say, that covers the first point on leadership. Now I'm going to move to the second critical aspect, which is communication. So even though that's very, very simple, it's still bridging the gap between two topics. In certain situations, though, especially in talks like TEDx talks or keynotes, I sometimes discourage my clients from explaining what's going to happen next. And the reason why that is because it breaks the flow of the storytelling and it almost makes it into more of a presentation. So it can actually feel like a commentary sometimes if you're saying, well, we've spoken about this and now I'm going to share with you this. In things like a TEDx or a keynote, that isn't necessarily an effective approach. So I'm kind of going against the grain a little bit, but you don't want to feel like you're being guided through a lecture. You want to feel like you're part of the conversation. So what to say instead? Well, instead of announcing the shift, so for example, instead of saying, so now we've talked about this, I'm going to now share with you this, it could be something as simple as stating the connection. So here's an example. You could say, leadership impacts culture in obvious ways, but it's how we communicate that brings leadership to life. Do you see how we've made that transition there, but you haven't said what you're going to do next? Or you can use an observation. So it's interesting how leadership can shape an organization, but what's even more powerful is how we measure that impact. You see, you're making an observation there instead of saying, we've talked about this and now we've talked about this. And even reflecting on a story you've just told works well. So, for example, this story highlights how crucial timing is, and that brings us to the next factor, adaptability. So you see, that is telling the story and reflecting on the story and then connecting with the next factor. So you're not saying, and now I'm going to do this. I would also say in presentations, maybe remove the, and now we're going to do this, because it's not a lazy segue, but it's a more obvious one. And there are much more subtle and effective ones that you can use. Rhetorical segues are also another example. So here is one. So this often involves asking a question that sets up the next section. So what happens when leaders fail to communicate their vision? I'm going to explore the impact of poor communication in leadership, or let's look at the impact of poor communication in leadership, or there is an impact of poor communication in leadership. So you're asking a rhetorical question, then you're linking to the next part of the talk. So this type of segue engages audience and primes them for the next point. There is also the conceptual segue. So these transitions connect two seemingly different topics with a common theme or idea. So say you're talking about leadership and now you want to shift to team dynamics. So you could say leadership is about influence, but influence only works when it's channeled through a strong team. And that strong team and building a cohesive team supports our leadership goals. So you're bridging the gap between leadership and teamwork by finding a common thread. Getting this nailed is absolutely golden. You can do this also in meetings, briefings, in any conversation when you want to bring someone onto a different point. So those conceptual segues are really, really key. When do you use them though? Well, I've just given some examples, but mainly in a talk or in a presentation between major sections. So if you're talking about one thing and then you're moving to another thing, there definitely needs to be a segue in between. So let's say you're giving a presentation on strategy And after discussing the current market landscapes, you might say, now that we understand the landscape, we need to look at how strategy can navigate these challenges. So it signals that you're moving on to the next big idea. So big major sections. Also, after data and statistics. So whenever you present numbers, your audience needs a moment to process before moving on. So you could use a segue like, these numbers are impressive, but what do they mean for our bottom line, and how we can explore that in terms of financial implications. Boom. So this helps people shift from absorbing information to understanding its relevance. And then another place where it works really well is during a Q&A part of any presentation or talk. So if you get a question or you do a Q&A session or you're maybe delivering a workshop and you get a question in the middle that takes you off course, you could use a segue to return to your main point. So you might say, that's a great question about our competition. We're definitely going to be focusing on this. But first, I think it's important to complete the discussion on product development. So you're segueing people back into the conversation in a really friendly, kind, and assertive way. So segueing isn't just used within a flow of a talk or a presentation. It can also be used within conversations. And honestly, I can't tell you how just knowing this skill, and as I say, I built it over many years, just having this as a skill is very versatile, and it's very in terms of enhancing your communication skills and credibility in communicating, it's an absolute key skill to have. So I highly recommend just giving this a go and practicing it. Because if you do this, the positive impact of this is that you're creating a more engaging experience for your audience. Think of it like leading a dance. So without a smooth transition, your partner stumbles, but with a seamless move, you're right there with you. And a well-paced segue guides your audience through your ideas effortlessly. Also, audience engagement. So the audience are going to stay with you for the entire time because they understand where you're headed. You know, the flow of any type of talk idea, presentation is so important for keeping people with you. They understand the journey that you're taking them on with this idea, and they're connected with you through all of those different transitions. They're going to stay with you to the end. And it also gives you confidence. It's a tool for your own confidence. When you know how to move between points, you're less likely to lose track of your thoughts and get flustered. And again, I'm testament to this. Sometimes it's remembering the segue between two stories or 2 points that enables me to feel confident because I know what's coming next. And finally, in terms of the benefits, clarity and flow, because speakers who use segues, they come across as thoughtful and organized. It feels cohesive, and that helps your audience remember your key points. So I'd really love your thoughts on this. It's not something that I've really heard being talked about, and I could talk a lot about this subject. I could really talk for hours on the minutiae and the granular elements of how we communicate effectively. It is, after all, what brings me joy and why I run this business. But it's something that is overlooked. And maybe you do this subconsciously, but you haven't taken into consideration how you might do it. So going back over what I've talked about today with the different types of segue, which are the verbal segues, the rhetorical segues, and the conceptual segues, what do you use, and how can you elevate the impact of your next presentation, keynote talk, or TEDx talk by really focusing in on bridging the gaps between those topics so you're taking your audience on a smooth and seamless, cohesive journey, and you're really making a big impact with your words? Let me know, get in touch, hello@helenpackham.com, and use the hashtag Words That Change Lives on social media to let me know what you think about this topic. Thanks for listening to Words That Change Lives. Please rate, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really means the world and helps me to reach more people so that we can all harness the power of our words and change lives for the better.